The gust of wind had nearly knocked the sled over. The anti-toxin package had been knocked off, and although it was wrapped in furs, it had sank into the snow. He pulled the sled to a halt, jumped off and started looking frantically for it. People's lives depended on it. He thrust his hand where he thought it had gone. He couldn't feel a thing. He pulled his arm out, took the glove off. The temperature was so cold, it was biting into his skin. He thrust his hand back in the hole, found the package, pulled it out. "99 years ago, in Nome, Alaska, a deadly, highly contagious disease called diptheria was spreading. But the town had been cut off. Winter had arrived. The sea was frozen. No ships could get there. No aircraft could get there. And no train could get there because of the terrible conditions across the mountains and across the plains. The nearest serum that could combat the toxins of diphtheria was 670 miles away in Anchorage. This was the setup for what has become one of the iconic races in the world, where dog sled teams go against each other in the name of sport, the Iditarod. But this was no sport. This, in 1925, was life or death. January 1925, the town of Nome in Alaska on the western peninsula was suffering. It was already cut off for the winter, and diphtheria had broken out, a deadly disease that's highly contagious, usually spread by respiratory droplets or by touching infected areas. Dr. Curtis Well had ordered the anti-toxin that's required, because it's not the bacteria that kill you, it's the toxin that they produce. But everything was frozen. He had no method of getting it there. He was in communication through the telegraph. 1,000 miles away in Anchorage, the officials there realised that they could get the serum to a town not quite nearby, but Nenana, 674 miles away from Nome. But thereafter, it would have to go by dog sled. It was the only possible way of getting across the country at this time of the year in the terrible conditions that were going to be experienced. Normally that route takes around 25 days for the postal service, and sometimes 9 days if you're really pushing it by dog sled. But the serum would lose all its effectiveness if it was frozen. So they calculated that they had to get there within 6 days. This was unprecedented. This had never been done. So the plan was to ship the toxin, the anti-toxin, to Nenana on train, and thereafter it would be picked up by a couple of teams of dog sledders, and they would move it forward to a town called Nulato, where one of Alaska's most famous and prolific dog sledders, the Norwegian-born former gold miner, ski champion, and 3 times winner of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, that was a grueling dog race that spanned more than 400 miles along the Bering Sea, was chosen to take it from Nulato to Nome. So he set off from Nome to go to Nulato, but then the Alaska governor, as politicians tend to do, decided he would change his mind. Well, changed the plan. Instead of 2 mushers meeting in Nulato, the serum was going to be carried by individual dog sledders in a relay. The idea being that each of the dog sleds would then be fresher and able to take off quicker and arrive quicker, thus cutting down the journey time. A reasonable plan. But there was no communications in those days, and the top man, Leonard Seppala, had no way of knowing where he was supposed to be. So the organisers just had to hope that the mushers would actually be able to connect together, transfer the anti-toxin, and make the journey to Nome. So when they decided to add more mushers to the plan, the governor had sent out a call for mushers to attend, to be counted, who would step up and take part in this. And about 20 mushers and 150 dogs in total decided that they would do it. And most of them just signed up, because it was just what they were going to do. There was just another day at the office. It needed to be moved, and they would do it. Some of them were racers, some of them were mailmen, some trappers, some guides. All had experience on the trails, and they all had experience of dog sledding. They came from a variety of different backgrounds, including indigenous Alaskans and Norwegian immigrants. So many of these names have been lost to history because basically the last guy into Nome with the anti-toxin, and spoiler, they did make it, he pretty much took all the credit for everything that happened. But we'll come on to that. So one of the last survivors in 1995 was interviewed by AP, and when he was asked about why he took part in the mission, he just said, "I just wanted to help. That's all." He didn't really think about it much. He just wanted to help, wanted to do his bit. And that's maybe an indication of the kind of people that live in Alaska. They just want to get on with it. They're just going to do what needs to be done. The dog sleds tended to be made from two different breeds in those days. We had Alaskan Malamutes and Siberian Huskies. The Malamutes were bigger, quite prone to overheating when they were driven hard and for too long, whereas the Siberian Huskies were smaller dogs but faster, had good hair, were able to cope with the conditions better, and didn't suffer from overheating. And the Siberian Huskies were a relative newcomer in those days, but they'd begun to prove themselves. And when Leonard Sepala had won 3 consecutive sweepstakes races, the Siberian Husky was beginning to take over as the preferred sled dog. All the mushers understood the risks, and they were out there on their own. There wasn't going to be anyone coming to help them. There were no helicopters in those days. There was no snowmobiles. There was no teams of mountain rescue. They were out on their own and they were going to do it. And the weather was set to be bad, real bad. So Wild Bill Shannon was his first team, and him and his Malamutes picked up the SERUM and took off heading towards Nome through the trail that was going to hit a number of different mushers and towns, and they would pass it on from one to the other. It was minus 62 degrees Fahrenheit when he set off, and he was running alongside the sled to keep warm as he started. But he still ended up with hypothermia and frostbite on his face, and three of his dogs died. So after a 4-hour break in Minto, he left the fire and went back out again and finished the rest of his 52-mile leg to Lovana. The weather grew increasingly worse, more and more dangerous. Edward Nollner, the guy that had been interviewed by AP, picked up the SERUM at Whiskey Creek and handed it over to his brother George 24 miles away in Galena. He recalled he couldn't even see his dogs in front of him because of the fog rolling off the snow. "I just let them go and they followed the trail," he told the AP. On the third day, another musher, Charlie Evans, who was Nollner's brother-in-law, lost his 2 lead dogs when the team tried to cross a river and the ice started to crack, soaking the animals. Evans picked up the harnesses and led the team for the rest of his stint, arriving in Nulato with the SERUM and the bodies of the dogs in his sled. What a brave man. What brave dogs. What a horrible way to die. While they continued battling through the weather and the respective legs, Leonard Sepala and his team of Siberian Huskies, they were still heading for Nulato. On the afternoon of January 31st, the musher Miles Gonigan delivered the SERUM to Shaktoolik, where Sepala was supposed to pick it up under the new plan. But another musher, Henry Ivanov, was waiting in case Sepala hadn't heard about the change. Sepala was actually quite close by. He'd crossed the Norton Sound, a 42-mile stretch of frozen sea that served as a shortcut, but was also extremely dangerous. It was so dangerous, especially in stormy conditions, that Gonigan had gone around it. Thanks to the shortcut, Sepala reached Shaktoolik just as Ivanov was leaving. Not expecting to see the other musher, Sepala nearly passed him. Ivanov, who was untangling his dogs after they had been spooked by a reindeer, saw Sepala and shouted, "The SERUM! The SERUM! I have it here!" Luckily, his words carried over to the other musher, and Sepala stopped and took on the SERUM. He then, and remember, this guy had travelled 170 miles to get to this point from Nome. He then turned around and took off on a 91-mile leg to Galavin. Without stopping to rest, he turned the team round and then charged off across the sound again, just as a violent storm was moving in. This was the team that was led by the now famous dog, Togo. Of the 150 dogs that pounded their way across the ice and snow during the Nome SERUM run, Leonard Sepala's lead dog, Togo, deserves a special mention. Sepala had initially dismissed Togo, who was born undersized and sickly, but on Togo's first run, a staggering 75 miles, Sapala realised he was a natural lead dog. Lead dogs are like sled dog quarterback. They determine the route the team will run, testing whether terrain will hold and navigating around potential obstacles. By this point, 12-year-old Togo was a seasoned and experienced lead dog and able to take the team safely on that dangerous and hazardous journey. So Sapala, Togo and the rest of the team set out across the Norton Sound again in minus 85 degrees Fahrenheit in total darkness. Sapala relied on Togo to navigate the team across the ice safely. So after crossing the Norton Sound safely, Leonard, Sapala and the team rested a few hours before travelling the rest of the way to Golovin, where Sapala handed the serum to Charlie Olsen. Olsen was blown off the trail and sustained frostbite and temperatures of minus 70 degrees, but he made it to Bluff and then handed the serum off to the penultimate musher, Gunnar Kaysen. Kaysen worked for Sapala and had chosen Siberian Husky Baldo, and this as his lead dog. Sapala didn't really rate this dog because he'd bred it and trained it, but he'd teamed it up with another dog named Fox. So Kaysen tried to wait out the storm, but when he realised it wasn't going to subside, he set off into it. At one point, an 80-mile-an-hour gust of wind smashed into the sled, sending the serum into the snowbank. It had been wrapped in fur to avoid it freezing, but it was in the snow, it was deep, he couldn't find it. He had to take his glove off and feel around for it. It got so cold that he suffered severe frostbite. Despite the conditions, Kaysen managed to complete his 28-mile leg early, then kept going for another 25 miles. Instead of waking up the next musher, he arrived at Nome. So he became the last musher, although he was not destined to be that. So he arrived on February the 2nd at 5:30 a.m. So that 20 mushers and their dogs had travelled 674 miles in 127 hours and 30 minutes, half a day faster than expected. So what happened to the town? Was it saved? Or was it even necessary that they had to do this? 300,000 units of serum had frozen, but luckily, once thawed, it was still effective. Dr. Curtis Welch was able to treat the patients. More people had fallen sick while they were waiting for the serum to come, and that increased the town's need for it. And then, after treatment, on February the 21st, 3 weeks after Kaysen arrived with the serum, the quarantine was lifted and the threat of the epidemic was officially over. So while everyone had been racing through the night, racing through the weather, taking on their own personal hardships, losing dogs to the weather, the ice, and the conditions, it was Gunnar Kaysen who, when riding into town frostbitten and exhausted, that grabbed all the glory. He became the face of the whole effort. The other mushers were miles away. I mean, in those days, you couldn't communicate. You didn't have telephones. And after finishing their respective legs, many of them had just gone home because it was just another day. So the Alaskan government gave them each $35. And the serum makers, the people that provided the anti-toxin, sent out medals. The press didn't really bother to track down the rest of them. As incredible as the feats of all the dog sled teams were, some saw it as just another day at the office. And the last surviving musher, Edward Nollner, that had been interviewed, he died in January 1999 at the age of 94. During his interview, he said, "I didn't think much about it. Just when people called me about it. That's the only time I really remembered." Gunnar Kaysen shared the credit with one other participant, his lead dog Baldo, and said that the dog had led him in even when he was blinded by the storm and couldn't see. So Kaysen and Baldo became celebrities and went to Hollywood. Baldo had his own hotel suite. He went to star in a movie. Baldo's Race to Nome, released in June 1925. And a statue of Baldo was unveiled in New York's Central Park in 1925. They also toured the vaudeville circuit with 6 other dogs that Kaysen had used in his team. Kaysen then went to return to Nome, but he couldn't afford to take the dogs with them, so he left them behind with the vaudeville promoter, who sold them on to a museum. Luckily, one visitor, George Kimball, was appalled to see the dogs living out their days so miserably. He convinced the museum's owner to sell them to him for $2,000. On the condition he could raise the money. He managed to do so, and the 7 dogs were moved into what is now the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo. Baldo died aged 14, 6 years later. He was stuffed and his body is still owned by the zoo. Leonard Seppala was furious that Togo didn't get the proper credit. I mean, he was more concerned that his dog hadn't been recognised. So he'd travelled nearly twice the distance of any of the mushers and over some of the most dangerous terrain. And he didn't think that Baldo and Kaysen were really worth the fuss. After Kaysen came back to Nome, Seppala took Togo on his own victory tour. They travelled around the country, met explorer Roald Amundsen, released a book, and starred in an ad campaign for Lucky Strike. In 1930, Seppala published his memoir, Alaskan Dog Driver. The end of the tour took them to Poland Spring, Maine, where Seppala co-founded a kennel breeding Siberian Huskies. When Seppala returned to Nome, he left Togo in Maine. Togo's health started failing 2 years later, and Seppala had him put to sleep on December the 5th, 1929, aged 16. Like Baldo, Togo was stuffed too, and is now on display in the headquarters of the Iditarod Trail sled dog race. Seppala lived to be 89 and is still a mushing legend. Every year during the Iditarod, the vet gives the Leonard Seppala Humanitarian Award to the musher who takes the best care of their dogs. There was a couple of big movies made. There was one released in 1995 that was animated and starred Balta as the dog, the half-wolf, half-husky underdog who becomes the unlikely lead of a single dog sled team charged with collecting and delivering the serum. They took a few liberties with the truth in that one. But then again, later on, there was a live-action movie made starring William Dafoe as Leonard Seppala, and Togo was represented by a dog, and this was more true to the actual story as it occurred. So every dog, in the end, does have his day. If you enjoyed this and would like to hear more, then please consider liking, sharing and subscribing.